An elderly woman in a wheelchair sat quietly at the edge of the plains, her eyes lost in the vastness of the horizon. Then, out of nowhere, a wild Mustang appeared, untamed and majestic, its movements graceful yet hesitant. As the horse drew closer, the unthinkable happened. An extraordinary connection was formed between the two. What could a wild, free creature possibly want with someone bound to a wheelchair? This moment sparked a chain of events that would leave everyone stunned, prepared to witness a story of resilience, hope, and the power of an unspoken bond that transcended all expectations. Margaret Peterson had lived on the edge of the plains for decades. Her little home was a refuge of memories, filled with pictures of a time when she had been an equestrian, riding horses with a grace that mesmerized everyone. But everything changed 20 years ago after a car accident left her paralyzed from the waist down. Now, at 78, her connection with horses was limited to watching the wild Mustangs that roamed the open plains from her porch. Margaret's days were predictable. Her granddaughter, Emma, visited weekly to bring groceries and keep her company. But most of the time, Margaret was alone, her heart longing for the freedom she once knew. The plains stretched endlessly beyond her backyard, a reminder of what was lost and the wild beauty that still thrived. One crisp morning, as Margaret wheeled herself outside to enjoy the gentle sun, she noticed something unusual. A lone Mustang stood at the edge of her property. Unlike the others that usually stayed far from human dwellings, this one was closer, too close. Its dark, shiny coat glistened under the sunlight, and its eyes, sharp and curious, seemed to lock onto hers. At first, Margaret froze. Wild horses didn't approach people, they avoided them. But this Mustang didn't move away. Instead, it stepped cautiously forward, its hooves crunching the dry grass. Margaret felt her pulse quicken. She clutched the arms of her wheelchair, her breath catching as the Mustang came within 20 feet of her. "What are you doing here?" she murmured softly, her voice trembling. The horse flicked its ears as though it understood her words. Margaret's heart ached as she watched the creature, so free, so full of life, standing before her. A pang of envy surged through her. She had spent 2 decades yearning for the kind of freedom this Mustang represented. The moment was broken when the Mustang suddenly turned and bolted, disappearing over the hill as quickly as it had appeared. Margaret sat there, her hands trembling. For the first time in years, she felt something stir inside her, a sense of wonder, a flicker of the spirit she thought she'd lost. When Emma arrived later that day, Margaret recounted the encounter. "A wild horse came up to me," she said, her voice tinged with awe. Emma laughed gently, assuming it was another one of her grandmother's vivid memories of the past. "Maybe it was just a dream, Grandma." But Margaret knew it wasn't a dream. That Mustang had come to her for a reason, and deep down she felt that their story wasn't over. The following morning, Margaret wheeled herself out to her usual spot on the porch. The sun was just rising, casting a warm orange glow over the endless plains. She scanned the horizon, her heart silently hoping to catch a glimpse of the mysterious Mustang. Hours passed, and the day carried on as usual, quiet and uneventful. But just as Margaret was about to return inside, she heard it. The faint, rhythmic sound of hooves against the ground. Her breath caught as she turned her gaze toward the plains. There it was, the same Mustang from the day before. The horse approached slowly, its movements cautious but deliberate. Margaret's heart pounded. She had seen many wild horses over the years, but none had ever shown this level of curiosity or boldness. This time, the Mustang came even closer, stopping mere feet away from her porch. It stood there, its eyes studying her as though trying to understand the frail woman before it. Margaret reached out instinctively, her hand trembling. "Hey there," she whispered. The Mustang didn't move but flared its nostrils, breathing in her scent. The connection between them felt almost tangible, as if the horse recognized something in Margaret that others could not. This time, the Mustang didn't bolt. Instead, it lingered, grazing nearby while keeping her in its peripheral vision. Margaret sat in silence, her eyes welling with tears. For the first time in years, she felt truly seen, not as a frail old woman in a wheelchair, but as someone worthy of attention and connection. As the days passed, the Mustang began appearing more frequently. Each visit brought it closer to Margaret's porch, and she began leaving out small buckets of water for it. She nicknamed the horse Shadow because of its sleek, dark coat that seemed to blend with the dusk. Emma, however, remained skeptical when Margaret shared her experiences. "Wild horses don't just walk up to people, Grandma. Are you sure you're not imagining things?" Margaret smiled knowingly. "Sometimes the wild recognizes the broken, Emma, and maybe it sees something in me that you don't." But not everyone in the town viewed Shadow's presence with the same reverence as Margaret did. A local rancher, Tom, had spotted the horse near his cattle. "That Mustang's trouble," he warned Margaret one afternoon. "They spook the herds, and if it starts hanging around here, someone's bound to go after it." Margaret's chest tightened. She knew the dangers wild Mustangs faced, being captured or worse, killed for wandering too close to human territory. Shadow was no exception, and the thought of losing this unexpected connection filled her with dread. That evening, Margaret sat on her porch watching the plains. Shadow appeared once more, this time venturing closer than ever. As Margaret looked into the horse's eyes, she felt a deep resolve. If the world was against Shadow, she would do everything in her power to protect him, even if it meant going against the very people she had called neighbors for decades. Shadow's visits became a daily occurrence. Each morning, Margaret wheeled herself to the porch, her heart lifting the moment she saw the dark figure against the golden plains. The Mustang's cautious nature began to soften, and Margaret found herself speaking to him in the same tender voice she once used with her beloved horses years ago. "Good morning, Shadow," she said one sunny afternoon, holding out a carrot in her wrinkled hand. Shadow hesitated at first, his ears flicking back and forth as he assessed the situation. Then, slowly and deliberately, he stepped forward, his nostrils flaring as he sniffed the offered treat. Margaret held her breath, afraid that the slightest movement might scare him off. But to her amazement, Shadow took the carrot from her hand, his soft lips brushing against her palm. Margaret's laughter rang out, pure and unrestrained, echoing across the plains. It was a sound she hadn't heard from herself in years, a laugh born of joy, not of politeness or obligation. Shadow stayed close that day, grazing in the yard as Margaret sat and watched, her heart swelling with a sense of purpose she thought she'd lost long ago. Word of the wild Mustang's unusual behavior began to spread through the small town. Neighbors stopped by, curious about the stories they'd heard. Some marveled at the bond between Margaret and Shadow, while others, like Tom the rancher, saw the horse as a nuisance. "That animal doesn't belong here, Margaret," Tom said one afternoon, his voice stern. "You're just encouraging him to stay, and that's not good for anyone. Wild horses need to be out there, not hanging around people." Margaret met his gaze, her own, steady and unwavering. "He's not bothering anyone, Tom. He's just looking for something. And so am I." Despite Tom's warnings, Margaret continued to nurture her bond with Shadow. She began leaving out hay and fresh water, setting up a small area near the porch where the horse could safely rest. Shadow's trust in her grew with each passing day, and soon he allowed her to stroke his neck, her frail fingers tracing the contours of his powerful muscles. For Margaret, these moments were more than just a connection to a wild animal. They were a lifeline. Each touch, Each gentle nicker from Shadow seemed to erase years of loneliness and pain. In him she saw a reflection of her own spirit, wild, untamed, and yearning for freedom despite the odds. But the peace between Margaret and Shadow was short-lived. One afternoon, as Shadow grazed near the house, a loud engine roared in the distance. Margaret's heart sank as she recognized the sound of Tom's truck pulling up the driveway. He stepped out, his expression grim. "Margaret, I've warned you. That horse has been spotted near my cattle again. If he causes any trouble, the authorities won't think twice about taking him down, and I won't be able to stop them." Margaret's voice wavered, but her resolve was firm. "Shadow isn't causing trouble, Tom. He's just lost, like so many of us are." Tom sighed, shaking his head. "You can't save every wild thing, Margaret. Sometimes it's just the way of the world." That night, Margaret sat on her porch, her eyes scanning the dark horizon. Shadow stood nearby, his silhouette framed by the moonlight. As she watched him, a tear slipped down her cheek. She had spent so many years feeling powerless, but now, for the first time, she had something worth fighting for. A week later, the calm of the plains was shattered by dark clouds rolling in from the horizon. The air was heavy, carrying the unmistakable scent of rain. Margaret sat on her porch, watching the sky darken, her hands gripping the arms of her wheelchair. Shadow hadn't visited yet that day, and unease gnawed at her. As the first drops of rain began to fall, Margaret's worry deepened. Shadow's visits had become so regular that his absence now felt like a missing piece of her day. By the time the storm hit in full force, with wind howling and rain lashing against her windows, she could barely sit still. The plains, usually a picture of serenity, now looked menacing under the flashing lightning. Margaret wheeled herself closer to the window, her heart pounding with fear for the wild horse. She had no way of knowing if Shadow had found shelter or if he was braving the storm out in the open. The night stretched on, the storm showing no signs of relenting. Margaret barely slept, her thoughts consumed by Shadow. At dawn, the rain finally eased, leaving the plains soaked and glistening. She hurried to the porch, scanning the landscape for any sign of her companion. Her breath caught when she spotted him. Shadow was limping, his dark coat matted with mud and water. He was moving slowly, his usual grace replaced by a painful shuffle. Margaret's heart broke at the sight. Without thinking, she called out to him, "Shadow, over here!" The Mustang's ears perked up at her voice. Despite his injury, he hobbled toward her, each step a visible struggle. When he finally reached the porch, Margaret saw the cause of his limp, a deep gash on his front leg, likely from debris thrown around by the storm. Margaret's hands trembled as she wheeled herself closer to him. "Oh, Shadow," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "You're hurt." She knew she couldn't leave him like this, but treating a wild horse was no small task. She reached out slowly, her fingers brushing against his damp coat. Shadow flinched at first, but he didn't retreat. Taking it as a sign of trust, Margaret grabbed a clean towel and some antiseptic from the house. She worked carefully, her movements gentle as she cleaned the wound. Shadow stood still, his dark eyes watching her with an almost human intensity. As she worked, Margaret realized how fragile this connection was. Shadow was a creature of the wild, and any prolonged contact with humans could put him at risk. Yet here he was, trusting her in a moment of vulnerability. The news of Shadow's injury spread quickly through the town. Some neighbors expressed concern, while others, like Tom, saw it as further proof that the Mustang was a liability. "You can't keep nursing that horse, Margaret," Tom warned. "If he gets dependent on you, he'll lose what makes him wild. And if he starts wandering near people, someone's going to report him." Margaret refused to listen. "He came to me because he needed help," she said firmly. Isn't that what we're supposed to do, help when we can? The following days were a test of both Margaret's resolve and Shadow's strength. She tended to his wound as best as she could, even enlisting Emma's help to bring fresh hay and water closer to the house. Shadow's limp began to improve, but Margaret knew the clock was ticking. The longer he stayed, the more likely it was that someone would take action against him. One evening, as Margaret sat on the porch with Shadow grazing nearby, she made a silent vow. She would protect him no matter what. Even if it meant confronting the town or risking her own safety, she couldn't let Shadow pay the price for simply existing. Shadow's recovery was steady but slow. His limp lessened with each passing day, and Margaret's bond with him grew stronger. Every morning she would find him waiting near the porch, his dark coat gleaming under the rising sun. Margaret's days, once marked by loneliness, were now filled with purpose. Shadow had reignited a spark within her, and for the first time in years she felt truly alive. But not everyone shared her joy. Tom's warnings had escalated into outright threats. "Margaret," he said one afternoon, standing on her porch with his hat in hand, "the county's been hearing complaints about a Mustang hanging too close to human property. They're sending a team out next week to round him up." The words hit Margaret like a punch to the gut. "Round him up? You mean take him to one of those holding facilities?" she asked, her voice trembling. Tom sighed, his expression softening. "It's for the best, Margaret. Wild horses can't stay near people. It's dangerous. For them and for us." Margaret shook her head, her grip tightening on the arms of her wheelchair. "He's not dangerous, Tom. He's just trying to survive, like the rest of us." But deep down, she knew the odds were stacked against her. Wild Mustangs captured by authorities were often placed in overcrowded holding pens or sold off to questionable buyers. The thought of Shadow losing his freedom was unbearable. That evening, Margaret sat on her porch, staring out at the plains. Shadow stood nearby, his strong, graceful form silhouetted against the fading light. She couldn't bear the idea of him being taken away. But what could she, an elderly woman in a wheelchair, possibly do to stop it? The answer came unexpectedly the next day. Emma arrived for her weekly visit, and Margaret shared the news about the roundup. To her surprise, Emma didn't dismiss her concerns. Instead, she listened intently, her brow furrowed in thought. "What if we moved him somewhere safer?" Emma suggested. "There's that wildlife sanctuary a few towns over. They have land set aside for Mustangs. It's not the wild, but it's better than a holding pen." Margaret's eyes lit up with hope. "You think they'd take him?" "I can call and find out," Emma said, already pulling out her phone. The sanctuary's response was encouraging. They agreed to take Shadow, provided he could be safely transported. But the logistics were daunting. Catching and moving a wild horse was no easy feat, and Margaret knew Shadow wouldn't trust anyone else the way he trusted her. The days that followed were a whirlwind of planning. Emma arranged for a horse trailer and enlisted the help of a local veterinarian to ensure Shadow's safety during transport. Margaret, meanwhile, spent as much time as possible with Shadow, preparing him for the journey. She spoke to him softly, explaining what was about to happen, even though she wasn't sure he could understand. When the day of the move arrived, the tension was palpable. The vet and Emma worked carefully to guide Shadow toward the trailer, using gentle coaxing and Margaret's presence to keep him calm. Shadow's unease was clear. His ears flicked back and forth, and he stomped the ground nervously. "It's okay, boy," Margaret said from her wheelchair, her voice steady despite the lump in her throat. "You're going to a place where you'll be safe, I promise." After what felt like an eternity, Shadow stepped into the trailer. The door closed behind him with a heavy thud, and Margaret felt a pang of guilt. She had done what she thought was best, but the sight of Shadow confined in the trailer was almost too much to bear. As the trailer pulled away, Margaret sat on the porch, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The plains stretched out before her, now empty and quiet. A single tear slid down her cheek. She had fought for Shadow, but the weight of their parting was heavier than she had anticipated. As the trailer disappeared over the horizon, Margaret's porch felt emptier than it had in years. Shadow's presence had filled a void she hadn't realized was so deep. Now she sat alone, grappling with the bittersweet mix of relief and loss. She had fought to save him, but the price of doing so was a parting she wasn't ready for. Emma called later that day to reassure her. "Grandma, Shadow's going to be fine. The sanctuary is beautiful. Rolling hills, plenty of space to roam. He'll be happy there." Margaret nodded, though Emma couldn't see her through the phone. "I know it's the right thing," she said softly, "but it doesn't make it easier." That night, sleep didn't come easily. Margaret's mind replayed the moment Shadow stepped into the trailer, his dark eyes filled with trust and uncertainty. She wondered if he felt betrayed, if he would forgive her for sending him away. The following days were a blur of silence. Margaret's routine returned to its old rhythm, but nothing felt the same. The plains, once alive with Shadow's presence, seemed vast and hollow. She missed the sound of his hooves, the gentle way he grazed nearby, and the connection they had shared. Then, a week after Shadow's departure, Emma arrived with unexpected news. "The sanctuary invited us to visit," she said with a smile. "They want you to see how he's doing." Margaret's heart leapt. The thought of seeing Shadow again filled her with a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in days. "When can we go?" she asked eagerly. The trip was arranged for the following weekend. Emma helped Margaret into the car, her wheelchair securely packed in the trunk. As they drove, Margaret stared out at the passing landscapes, her thoughts consumed by Shadow. Would he remember her? Would he still trust her after everything? The sanctuary was nestled in a valley surrounded by rolling hills. As they pulled into the driveway, Margaret's breath caught. The sight of open pastures filled with grazing Mustangs was breathtaking. A staff member greeted them warmly and led them to Shadow's enclosure. Margaret's hands trembled with anticipation as they approached. And then she saw him. Shadow stood near the edge of the fence, his dark coat gleaming in the sunlight. He was no longer limping, and his stance had regained the proud, confident air of a wild horse. Margaret's eyes filled with tears as she wheeled closer. "Shadow," she called softly. The Mustang's ears twitched, and he turned toward her. For a moment, he stood still, as if processing the sound of her voice. Then, to everyone's amazement, he walked toward her, his steps slow but deliberate. Margaret extended her hand, her heart pounding as Shadow lowered his head. His soft muzzle brushed against her palm, and the tears she had been holding back spilled freely. "You remember me," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. The staff member smiled. "He's been thriving here, but it's clear you have a special bond with him." Margaret spent hours with Shadow that day, speaking to him in the same tender voice she always had. She stroked his neck, feeling the strength of the creature she had fought so hard to protect. When it was time to leave, Margaret's heart ached, but it was different this time. She knew Shadow was safe, free to live as he was meant to. As she said her goodbyes, she whispered, "Be happy, Shadow. You'll always have a piece of my heart." As Margaret and Emma drove home from the sanctuary, the silence in the car was different this time. It wasn't the heavy quiet of loneliness, but a peaceful stillness, filled with the satisfaction of knowing Shadow was safe. For the first time in years, Margaret felt like she had truly made a difference. The days that followed were brighter. Margaret spent her mornings on the porch, not waiting for Shadow to appear, but simply enjoying the beauty of the plains. She still missed him, of course, but the knowledge that he was thriving brought her a quiet joy. She began writing in a journal, documenting her time with Shadow and the lessons he had taught her about resilience, trust, and the power of connection. Word of Margaret's bond with Shadow spread through the small town. Neighbors who once dismissed her stories now stopped by to ask about the Mustang. Even Tom, the gruff rancher who had once viewed Shadow as a nuisance, paid her a visit. "I heard you got him into that sanctuary," he said, tipping his hat. "Guess I was wrong about you two. Took guts to do what you did." Margaret smiled, her eyes twinkling. "He taught me more about courage than I ever could have taught him." Emma, inspired by her grandmother's journey, began volunteering at the sanctuary on weekends. She would return with stories of Shadow, who had become something of a legend among the staff. "They say he's a leader," Emma told Margaret one evening. "He's always the first to explore new pastures and the other horses follow him. It's like he knows he's free." Margaret's heart swelled with pride. She knew Shadow had always been special, and hearing about his thriving life at the sanctuary was the reassurance she needed. One day, Emma suggested hosting a small fundraiser to support the sanctuary. Margaret eagerly agreed, offering to share her story as part of the event. The gathering was held in her backyard, with neighbors, friends, and even some sanctuary staff in attendance. Margaret sat in her wheelchair, looking out at the familiar faces. She took a deep breath and began. "I spent years feeling trapped by my circumstances, my body, and my own mind. But then a wild Mustang came into my life. Shadow reminded me that freedom isn't just about where you are, it's about how you choose to live." Her words moved the crowd, and by the end of the evening, they had raised enough funds to help care for several more Mustangs at the sanctuary. Margaret felt a deep sense of fulfillment, knowing that Shadow's story was making a difference far beyond her own life. As the seasons changed, Margaret's connection with Shadow remained strong. Emma often took her to visit the sanctuary, where Shadow would greet her with the same gentle nuzzle. Each visit reinforced the unspoken bond between them, a bond that had transcended the boundaries of species and circumstance. On a crisp autumn morning, Margaret sat on her porch, watching the golden sunlight stretch across the plains. She thought about Shadow, running free in the sanctuary's vast pastures, leading his herd with the same strength and grace that had drawn her to him in the first place. A smile spread across her face as she whispered to the wind, "Thank you, Shadow, for reminding me what it means to truly live." Margaret's life had been changed forever by a wild Mustang, and though their time together had been brief, the lessons he had left behind would echo in her heart for the rest of her days. Margaret and Shadow's story is a testament to the unbreakable bonds that can form between humans and animals. Their connection wasn't just about survival, it was about finding hope, healing, and courage in the face of life's challenges. Shadow's journey to safety and freedom reflected Margaret's own rediscovery of purpose and resilience. If this story touched your heart, remember that every small act of kindness can create a ripple of change. Let Margaret and Shadow's story inspire you to see the beauty in the connections around you, no matter how unexpected they may be. Before you go, don't forget to subscribe to our channel, like this video, and share it with someone who loves stories of hope and courage. Together, we can continue sharing these inspiring tales that remind us of the extraordinary power of compassion. The dog was so hungry, but wouldn't eat. What the vet discovered will bring you to tears. He was dying in silence. No blood, no wounds, just a beautiful golden retriever curled up on a cold clinic floor. Refusing food, refusing water, no tags, no name. And when the vet looked inside his mouth, she froze. What she found wasn't natural. It wasn't an injury. It was placed there, deliberate, designed, and deadly. What happened next will break your heart, and then piece it back together in the most unexpected way. Before we begin, tell me, Where are you watching from? Drop your country in the comments. Let's see how far Leo's story travels. And if you believe dogs deserve love, not control, hit subscribe. Because this story, it's going to stay with you forever. Early autumn wind rolled through Asheville, North Carolina, brushing yellow leaves across the sidewalk and rattling the clinic's faded wind chime with a tired clang. Clouds hung low and heavy in the sky, promising a drizzling rain before sunset. At the edge of town, nestled between a shuttered antique store and a bakery that smelled perpetually of cinnamon and burnt sugar, stood Ridgeview Animal Clinic. Inside, the fluorescent lights hummed low as Dr. Clara Monroe wiped down the steel examination table for the third time that hour, not because it needed it, but because her mind did. Clara was 38, tall and lean, with auburn hair pulled into a practical braid, and gray-blue eyes that rarely smiled anymore. Once known for her warmth and effortless laughter, Clara had changed after the loss of her daughter 2 years prior. A sudden illness, a missed diagnosis, the kind that unravels even the strongest souls. Now, Clara spoke in measured tones, moved with precision, and clung to the structure of her work like it was the last thing anchoring her to the world. Her staff respected her deeply, but kept a quiet distance, sensing that part of her was permanently somewhere else. That afternoon, a knock on the clinic's glass door interrupted the silence. Clara looked up to see Officer Ben Keller, a stocky man in his mid-40s with kind eyes and a permanent sunburn across his neck. He was holding the frayed end of a leash, but the leash itself dragged the ground, its clasp hanging loose. "No collar," Ben said as he opened the door. Found him behind the old train depot, was just lying there. Not a mark on him, but he won't move. Thought you should take a look. At first, Clara didn't see the dog, only the way Ben kept glancing back toward his truck, as if reluctant to leave the animal alone even for a second. Then she saw him. Curled in the bed of the truck was a golden retriever, larger than average, fur thick and sun-dulled to a deeper golden hue. His frame suggested he was once strong, healthy, 4 or 5 years old at most, but now he was nothing but ribs and silence. His head lifted slightly as Clara approached, but his eyes did not meet hers. They stared past her, distant, like he was trying to remember something just out of reach. "Has he eaten?" she asked. Ben shook his head. "Won't touch food or water, just lies there, not aggressive, not scared, just off." Clara stepped into the truck bed, crouching beside the dog. He didn't flinch, didn't growl. But when she extended a hand, he barely sniffed it. No tail wag, no sign of interest. It was as though she wasn't even there. "We'll take him in," Clara said softly. "Can you help me lift?" Ben nodded. Together, they gently carried the dog inside and settled him on a padded mat in exam room 2. Clara placed a shallow dish of water beside him, then another with soft canned food. The dog didn't move, not even a twitch of his nose. She studied him. No visible injuries, no swelling, bruising, or limping. His coat was matted with dirt but free of fleas or ticks. His gums were pale but intact. When she gently touched his jawline, he tensed, barely, but enough for her to notice. Something was wrong, but not in the way she could name. "I'll call him Leo," she said quietly. Ben raised an eyebrow. "You naming him already?" "It helps," Clara replied. "Helps me see him as something more than a case." Ben nodded, gave Leo one last look, then excused himself to finish paperwork back at the station. Left alone, Clara sat cross-legged beside Leo on the floor. She spoke in soft tones, the kind reserved for skittish kittens and heartsick animals. She told him about the storm that was coming, about the clinic's old heater that always clicked twice before turning on, about the robin that nested on the windowsill in spring and refused to leave until her chicks were brave enough to fly. Leo didn't move, but as the wind picked up and rain began to tap against the windows, Clara could have sworn his ear flicked at the sound of her voice. Just once. And so she stayed. She stayed until the rain came heavier, until the wind drove leaves in spirals across the parking lot, until the clinic's backlight flickered and the building seemed to exhale into the quiet night. Leo never touched the food, but he didn't turn away either. And somehow, that was enough to make Clara keep hoping. The rain had passed by morning, leaving behind a silver mist that clung low to the ground and painted the windows of Ridgeview Animal Clinic with condensation. The mountains beyond Asheville were still wrapped in fog, their outlines softened like memories. Inside the clinic, the scent of antiseptic mingled faintly with the earthy musk of wet fur and coffee left too long on a warmer. Dr. Clara Monroe stood beside exam room 2, her clipboard in hand, silently watching Leo. The golden retriever had not moved from his place on the padded mat, but something in his eyes seemed different. Not alert, not exactly, but less vacant, as though a curtain was lifting slowly from behind his gaze. Clara tucked a strand of hair behind her ear and stepped into the room, closing the door gently behind her. She moved without speaking, taking note of Leo's posture. He lay with his front paws extended, his head resting on them, ears slightly perked, eyes tracking her movements, but without fear or excitement. It was a stillness Clara recognized not of peace, but of survival. She placed the clipboard on the counter, then knelt beside him with slow, deliberate calm. In her other hand was a stethoscope, and tucked under her arm a small notepad with worn corners. It was the same notepad she hadn't used in over 2 years, one that had remained in her drawer, gathering dust ever since her daughter Lily passed a journal she once filled with joyful notes about rescued kittens and funny dog habits. Today she'd picked it up again without thinking. She wrote, Day 2. Leo still not eating. No aggression. Observes everything. Pupils reactive. Unresponsive to food voice or scent stimulation. Refuses water. Tension noted along jawline. Must examine further. Let's take a closer look at you, Clara murmured, placing the stethoscope to Leo's chest. The rhythmic beat of his heart thudded steady beneath the fur. Not rapid, not slow, just tired. When she lifted his lips to examine his gums again, she noticed it just the slightest flicker of resistance. He didn't growl, but his tongue curled oddly as if guarding something deeper in his mouth. Clara frowned. She hadn't caught that yesterday. Okay, boy. I'm not here to hurt you, she whispered, reaching for a small LED penlight. She angled Leo's head gently, running her fingers along his jowls with practiced ease. His eyes tightened for a moment, and that was when she saw it, a faint wince as her hand passed beneath his jaw and a slight tremor through his hind leg. There was pain, but not external. Something internal. Clara narrowed her focus. She opened his mouth carefully, watching for any sign of aggression. Leo remained still, though his tail tensed and his paws dug slightly into the mat. As the light caught the roof of his mouth, Clara paused. She leaned in closer. There, just along the left side of his upper palate, was a small ridge. Not a wound, not inflammation. It looked like a slit, clean-edged and shallow. It wasn't natural, and it wasn't recent. Clara blinked, then looked again. The tissue had healed around it like it had been there for weeks, maybe months. She pulled back slowly, letting his mouth close. Her breath caught in her throat. Her mind was already racing through possibilities, embedded, object, foreign trauma, surgical incision. But who would surgically alter a stray dog, and why in the roof of his mouth? The door creaked slightly, and Clara turned to see Maya Reese, the clinic's vet assistant, stepping in. Maya was in her mid-20s, petite, with a constellation of freckles across her cheeks and a warm energy that filled any room. She wore lavender scrubs and carried a clipboard tucked under her arm along with a bowl of fresh water. "He still hasn't touched anything," Maya said quietly, placing the bowl down. "I tried with a little tuna water." "Nothing." Clara nodded, but her expression was distant. "There's something in his mouth," she said. Maya tilted her head. "Like an obstruction? No. Something placed there. Hidden, maybe. I need to get imaging. I'll call Dr. Simmons for a second opinion." Maya's brows lifted. "You think this was intentional?" "I don't know yet," Clara said, voice low. She stood glancing once more at Leo. He'd moved barely, but now he was looking directly at her. Not past her. At her. That afternoon, Clara shut herself in her office between appointments and opened the notepad again. The pages felt thinner than they used to. Her handwriting, once casual and loopy, was now neat and precise. Controlled. She wrote unusual ridge in the roof of Leo's mouth. Not consistent with trauma. Healing indicates insertion was done weeks or months prior. Could be surgical. Need radiographs. She paused. "First time I've written like this in 2 years. Feels wrong. Feels right." She stared at the page. Thought of Lily. Of all the dogs and cats she'd helped since but never truly seen. Not until Leo. And now here she was journaling about a dog who wouldn't eat, wouldn't drink, wouldn't look anyone in the eye. Until today. In the hallway, Maya knocked lightly. "Clara, you have a walk-in. A girl with her mom. Says she lives down the block. Her cat's limping. I'll be right there." Clara closed the journal and tucked it beneath the folder labeled Leo before heading out. As she walked, her mind circled back to the faint slit in the dog's mouth and the growing sense that Leo wasn't just a stray. He was something else. And whatever had been done to him, someone had wanted it to stay hidden. It was nearly dusk by the time Clara slipped on her lead apron and positioned the X-ray machine over Leo's head. The day had been unusually long, marked by back-to-back appointments, 2 canceled surgeries due to supply delays, and a burst pipe in the staff bathroom. The rain that had left the town soaked the day before had cleared, replaced now by a dry chill that curled around the corners of the old brick building like a whisper. But Clara hadn't noticed the cold, not with Leo lying so still beneath her, his eyes flickering up at her like he was waiting for something he didn't understand. The room was dim-lit only by a small lamp in the corner and the green glow of the machine's display panel. Maya Reese stood nearby, arms crossed lightly over her scrub top, watching with quiet tension. Clara didn't speak much as she worked her hands steady, her gaze focused. Leo lay sedated, his breathing slow and regular. It had taken 2 attempts to coax him into position on the imaging table. He had resisted briefly, his body tensing at the touch of metal, but once Clara pressed her palm softly to his ribs and whispered his name, he relaxed. The first scan appeared on the monitor in shades of gray and shadow. Clara leaned in her breath, catching. There, nestled in the upper curvature of Leo's hard palate embedded beneath the tissue but distinct in shape, was an oval structure, small metallic, not naturally occurring. Clara's eyes narrowed. It wasn't a shard. It wasn't random. It was positioned with surgical precision. "That's not a bone fragment," Maya murmured behind her. "No," Clara replied, her voice low. "That's been placed. It took nearly an hour to prep for the procedure." Clara worked in silence, reviewing the scan from every angle, consulting an old anatomy atlas just to confirm what she already knew. There was no logical explanation for what she was seeing. She'd removed fish hooks from dogs, slivers of glass, even a sewing needle swallowed by a cat. But never this. By the time the incision was made, night had fallen completely, and the clinic lights shone against the frosted windows like miniature moons. Clara made the cut with a scalpel so fine it barely parted the tissue. She worked slowly, avoiding nerve clusters, easing the flesh aside with the care of someone unlocking a door no one was meant to find. Then she saw it gleaming faintly beneath a thin veil of blood. It was no larger than the head of a pinky nail, perfectly smooth metallic gray. As she extracted it with forceps, it gave off a faint hum, like a tiny tuning fork vibrating on a distant frequency. Maya's eyes widened. "Did you hear that?" Clara nodded, lowering the object into a sterile dish. It continued to hum for 3 full seconds before falling silent. She brought it closer to the counter and examined it under the magnifier. No markings, no serial number, no branding or surface damage. Just a single hairline seam down the center as though it had been molded in halves. It wasn't a pet tracker. It wasn't a medical implant. It was something else entirely. And then the back door creaked. Both women turned as a pair of footsteps tiptoed across the hallway tiles. A small figure appeared in the doorway, Sophie Leland, age 10, wearing a puffy purple jacket, 2 sizes too big, with a canvas backpack swinging from one shoulder and a pair of untied sneakers slapping against the floor. Sophie had moved into the apartment building across the street just 3 weeks ago with her mother. She was short for her age, wiry, with wide brown eyes and a nervous energy that made her fidget constantly. Most afternoons, Clara had noticed her loitering near the side window of the clinic, pretending to study the flowers in the planter while really watching Leo through the glass. "Hi, Sophie," said eyes flicking from Clara to the dish on the table. I brought something. For the dog." Clara blinked. "Sophie. Right, you shouldn't be here alone. It's late." "I know," Sophie whispered. "But I heard him whining earlier. He doesn't do that much. So I thought maybe he was scared." Clara sighed gently and wiped her gloves. "He's asleep now. We had to give him medicine." Sophie stepped inside, slowly pulling something from her backpack, a worn-out stuffed animal, a golden retriever, plush with one ear half chewed off. "This is Buddy. I've had him since I was 3. If Leo wakes up and he's scared, maybe he can borrow him." Clara felt a lump rise in her throat that she didn't expect. She nodded once. "That's very kind." Maya stepped forward, kneeling beside Sophie. "Did you have a dog?" Before Sophie shook her head. "I wanted one, but my mom says I get too nervous. I used to be scared of animals. But not him." Leo stirred slightly on the table as if responding to her voice. Clara turned back to the tray. The chip, if that's what it was, remained inert, silent, but its presence lingered in the air like static. She took a photo with her phone and made a note to contact someone, anyone with a background in veterinary tech or biomedical design. Later, as she walked Sophie to the edge of the parking lot, Clara handed her back the stuffed dog. "No," Sophie said softly. "Let him keep it tonight. He might need it more than I do." The sun had not yet risen when Clara unlocked the clinic doors, her breath fogging in the crisp mountain air. Asheville was quiet. At that hour, storefronts, shuttered cars still tucked under carports, the occasional street lamp blinking out with the slow surrender of night. Inside Ridgeview Animal Clinic, the silence felt heavier than usual, clinging to the corners of each hallway, pressing gently against the walls. Clara moved quickly, her boots soft on the tiled floor, heading straight to exam room 2. Leo lay curled on his mat, his head resting beside the plush retriever toy Sophie had left the night before. His breathing was steady, his body finally relaxed in sleep. The surgery had gone smoother than Clara expected, no complications, minimal bleeding, and Leo had come out of sedation without panic. But it was what came next that held her breath in a fragile kind of hope. She crouched beside him, brushing her fingers lightly along his back. "Morning, Leo," she whispered, not expecting a response. But then he stirred. Not the sharp, disoriented twitch she'd seen before, but something gentler. His ears lifted slightly. His tail twitched once. His eyes opened. They were clearer. For the first time, they didn't drift or avoid. They met hers steady, searching aware. Clara swallowed and stood crossing to the metal dish she had placed earlier. Inside was a blend of warm rice, soft chicken and bone broth, easy to chew, gentle on the stomach. She set it on the floor near Leo and stepped back. At first, nothing happened. Leo looked at the bowl, then at her, then back again. Clara didn't move. She barely breathed. It felt like waiting for a miracle, one so delicate it might break if she acknowledged it aloud. Leo inched forward, sniffed, paused. Then, with a careful motion, he licked once, then again. Then he ate slowly, methodically, each bite deliberate but undeniable. Clara's eyes filled instantly, the tears coming before she had time to register them. She covered her mouth with her hand and leaned against the counter, watching this golden creature, once locked in stillness and silence, return to life through the simple act of eating. It wasn't just hunger. It was permission. Release. Something had been lifted, and now Leo was stepping back into himself, piece by piece. The hum from the removed device still lingered in her memory, haunting and precise. She hadn't thrown it away, of course. It now sat locked in a specimen container inside her desk drawer, far from reach, but never far from mind. Clara had documented it, taken photos, even uploaded one blurry clip of the audio to a colleague from veterinary school who now worked in biomedical research. She hadn't heard back yet. She sank into the corner chair, her hand still covering her mouth as Leo finished half the bowl. He lifted his head after, and instead of lying back down, he looked around the room, sniffed the air, then turned to her with something unspoken in his eyes. Gratitude, maybe. Or simply presence. Later that morning, Clara made a fresh pot of coffee and stared out the break room window at the small patch of fenced-in grass behind the clinic. The sky had cleared completely. The fog from earlier had lifted, revealing a brilliant blue. Leaves fluttered down like confetti from the maples that lined the alley. She had barely slept the night before. Not from worry, but from the dream. It had been years since she'd dreamt of Lily. In the dream, Clara stood at the edge of a sun-drenched field. The grass was tall, golden, swaying in waves. And there was Lily, barefoot, 8 years old, her dark curls bouncing as she ran, arms outstretched. Laughing. She ran towards something, not away. And then Clara saw what it was. Leo. Whole and strong, his coat shimmering in the light, bounding beside Lily like they'd known each other all their lives. Clara had tried to move, to call out, but her voice stayed locked in her throat. She watched them until the edges of the dream began to blur and dim. The last thing she saw was Lily turning toward her, smiling as if to say, "It's okay now, Mom." When she woke, the ache in her chest was softer. Still there, but different. By noon, Leo had finished another half bowl of food and was resting peacefully in his recovery kennel paws, twitching slightly in what Clara hoped were dreams, not memories. Maya peeked in just as Clara was updating his chart. "He ate?" Maya asked. Clara nodded slowly, a soft smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "He ate." Maya grinned. "That's huge." Clara said nothing more, just closed the chart and glanced at Leo again, as if checking to make sure it had really happened. That he was still there. That it wasn't just part of the dream. That afternoon, Sophie returned. She knocked this time, backpack slung tight across her shoulders, her hair tied back in a messy braid with a pencil stuck through it like a pin. Clara met her at the side door. "He ate," Clara said. Sophie lit up. "Really? Really?" Sophie came in, careful to walk quietly. She sat cross-legged near Leo's kennel where he lay awake now, blinking slowly. When Sophie pulled out a small paperback book and began to read aloud something about a horse named Flicka, Leo didn't turn away. He watched, her head tilted slightly. It wasn't much, but it was more than before. And for Clara, that was everything. It was a Thursday afternoon, the kind where the sky looked bleached of all color, and the wind seemed to forget which way to blow. A gray hush had settled over Asheville, broken only by the occasional rustle of dry leaves scraping across the asphalt outside Ridgeview Animal Clinic. Clara stood at the reception desk reviewing Leo's progress notes while Maya cleaned out the supply closet in the back. Leo, now more alert than ever, lay peacefully in his crate in the corner of the lobby, his head resting on his paws, his eyes half closed but aware. Even Sophie, who had taken to visiting each day after school, was running late, her absence marked by a quiet emptiness Clara hadn't expected to notice. That was when the front door opened. The bell above it chimed softly, but something in the air changed as the man stepped inside. He was in his mid-40s, tall, lean, but not athletic, dressed in worn jeans and a flannel shirt, too neatly pressed for a man claiming to work outdoors. His boots were spotless except for the soles, which left behind faint streaks of red clay on the mat. His hair was dark graying at the temples, and his face had that pleasant blankness trained professionals wore unremarkable deliberately so. "Afternoon," he said, voice smooth, confident. "I'm looking for a dog. Might have been brought in. Golden retriever, male, scar on his front right paw." Clara's hand froze over the keyboard. Her stomach tightened. "We see a lot of dogs," she said carefully, not yet turning around. "Do you have a photo?" He smiled politely. "Unfortunately, no. He went missing a couple weeks ago. Slipped a collar. Smart dog. Answers to Rusty. He's got a habit of wandering near old train yards. Thought someone might have brought him in here." Clara turned, finally meeting his gaze. "No collars on the dog we found? No microchip?" He wasn't wandering. He was lying still in a lot behind the depot, nearly unresponsive. The man's smile flickered just for a second. "Well, he said that sure sounds like Rusty. He always did love to play dead when he didn't want to come home." Leo had lifted his head now. His ears were back, his body tense. He didn't growl. He didn't bark. But his tail tucked in and his body shifted until he was pressed against the back wall of the crate. Clara took a single step in front of him. "He's scared of you," she said. The man raised an eyebrow as if offended. "That doesn't sound like my Rusty." He didn't react like this to animal control. Not to anyone. Until now. There was a long pause. "I can understand your concern," the man said, taking a slow step forward. "You've done good work. Really. He looks a lot better than I expected. I'd be happy to pay for his care. But he belongs to my brother, and I promised I'd get him back." Clara's voice was ice. "Do you have proof of ownership?" "I've got a note in my truck," he said, gesturing to the lot outside. Wouldn't take a second to grab it. Leo let out a low whine behind her, a sound so raw it felt like it had been dragged out of his chest. Clara stiffened. "I'll wait here," she said flatly. The man shrugged, turned, and walked back through the door, letting it swing slowly shut behind him. From the corner of the side hallway, Sophie emerged like a ghost. She had arrived unnoticed through the back door, her backpack still on her shoulders and a phone clutched tight in her hand. "I took a picture," she whispered. Clara blinked. "You what?" "His truck. The plates. I saw him pull in while I was walking over." Sophie held up her phone. Sure enough, there it was, a clear shot of a white pickup parked crookedly along the curb license plate in full view. Clara stared at her. That was dangerous. Sophie looked down. "I didn't want him to take Leo. He didn't look like someone who loved a dog." Clara exhaled slowly, emotions battling behind her eyes. She crouched beside Leo, who still trembled, his breathing shallow. "You're okay," Clara murmured, resting a hand gently on his shoulder. "He's gone." Through the clinic windows, they watched the man standing by his truck pretending to search the glove box. But after a minute, he gave up the act. He slid into the driver's seat, shut the door with a snap, and drove away without even glancing back. Clara stood, her hand still resting on Leo. "Maya," she called over her shoulder, "I need you to run a plate." The following morning brought a sharp wind that rattled the clinic windows and sent golden leaves tumbling in chaotic spirals across the parking lot. Clara stood in her office, a steaming mug of coffee forgotten on her desk, as she stared down at the tiny metal object resting in a clear containment dish. The strange, seamless chip had lost its hum after the first day, but its silence felt even more menacing. She had taken dozens of photos, recorded its faint sound, and made meticulous notes. But now she needed answers she couldn't find in textbooks. She picked up her phone and scrolled through her contacts until she landed on a name she hadn't touched in years, Dr. Emmett Ryland. Emmett had been a close friend back in veterinary school, brilliant, intense, and always one step ahead in every technical field. He had since moved into neural bioengineering, now working for a private lab contracted occasionally by the Department of Defense. They'd drifted apart after Clara's daughter passed, mostly because Clara had drifted away from everything. But if anyone could tell her what the hell this thing was, it was Emmett. She hit call. Clara Monroe. His voice answered after the second ring. Either this is a ghost, or the world is ending. I need a favor. There was a pause. Send me what you've got. An hour later, she was standing in the break room when Sophie arrived, clutching a small envelope in her mittened hands. Her cheeks were red from the wind, and a sprinkle of freckles dotted her nose, which crinkled when she smiled. I brought something for Leo, she said, pulling out a photo, a printout of a Polaroid-like image. It showed Leo asleep curled around the stuffed animal she had given him. I thought he should have a picture of himself being safe. Clara smiled genuinely. He'll love it. They settled in near Leo's resting crate. Sophie sat cross-legged on the floor, flipping open a notebook. She had started drawing again, sketching Leo in different sleeping positions. Clara leaned against the wall, her own notebook in hand, though she didn't write. For a while, the silence between them was warm. Then Sophie glanced up. Can I ask you something kind of not normal? Clara nodded. Go ahead. Why do you look sad even when you smile? Clara blinked. It was such a disarming question asked without malice, only observation. My daughter, she said quietly. Her name was Lily. She died a couple years ago. She got sick really fast. The kind of sick where there's nothing you can do but hold their hand and lie. Sophie didn't say anything. She just nodded and kept her eyes on her drawing. You remind me of her, a little, Clara added. She used to draw animals, too, but she was scared of dogs until the very end. I guess that's one thing she never had the chance to grow into. Sophie traced a line across her sketch. I used to be scared of everything. Mostly people. Then Leo came. Clara looked at the child beside her, saw the steadiness in her hands now compared to the jittery girl who'd first wandered into the clinic. And now I think I want to be a vet. Clara smiled through a sharp pang in her chest. That would be a good world. Her phone buzzed on the counter. A message from Emmett. I need to see this in person. By early evening, Emmett Ryland had arrived. He stepped through the side entrance of the clinic with a laptop under one arm and a reinforced case in the other. Emmett was in his early 40s with the look of someone who slept in laboratories and forgot haircuts. His gray eyes were sharp, restless, and always calculating. He wore a heavy coat with deep pockets and scuffed boots dusted with road salt. Clara met him in the lab, her arms crossed. Still dramatic, she noted. Still ignoring safety protocols, apparently Emmett replied, snapping on latex gloves. He popped open the containment dish, peered at the chip, and let out a low whistle. Where did you find this? In the mouth of a dog who wasn't eating and looked like he'd given up on life. Emmett clicked open his laptop and started running scans. Do you know what this is? I know it's not a tracking chip, and I know it's not anything I've ever seen in civilian medicine. It's not. He adjusted the sensor, watching the readouts on his screen. This is neural tech. Early generation pre-civilian testing, used in DoD behavioral modification trials. Designed for canines. It doesn't just track, it modulates. emotion pain threshold, even memory patterning. Clara felt her skin go cold. Are you telling me someone implanted a military device in a stray? Emmett looked up. He wasn't stray, not originally. Dogs like that don't end up in train yards by accident. He was part of a controlled experiment, one that either failed or escaped. Clara stared at the chip. What does it do? It pulses low-frequency stimuli to the brain's amygdala and prefrontal cortex, controls emotional spikes, blunts fear, increases obedience responses, but only under programmed triggers. And if it malfunctions, then you get a dog who stops eating, stops reacting, stops living. She leaned back, breath shaky. They broke him. Emmett nodded grim. But you fixed him. Somehow. That doesn't happen often. They locked the chip away again. Emmett promised to analyze it further from his lab and send updates. As he left, he paused beside Leo's crate, watching as the dog looked up at him, not flinching, just watching. He's still in there, Emmett murmured. You brought him back. Clara didn't respond. She was too busy wondering who had sent Leo into the world broken, and what else might still be out there. The scent of broken glass hung in the air like static when Clara arrived at Ridgeview Animal Clinic the next morning. It was just after dawn, the pale light still struggling to filter through a haze of low-lying clouds. Clara paused in the doorway, her keys still in hand, staring at the jagged hole in the side window. Shards littered the floor beneath, mixed with dried leaves blown in from the wind. Her chest tightened. Inside the clinic was eerily quiet. No alarms had been triggered because she hadn't installed any. She had always believed in the goodness of her small town. She believed the clinic was a sanctuary. But this felt like desecration. She moved through the hallway slowly, her boots crunching glass. Her office door hung ajar. The filing cabinet was open. The bottom drawer, the one where she had locked the chip in a sealed container, was split clean through. The lock had been wrenched open with something crude. Clara's breath caught as she saw the container lid snapped in two empty. Taped to the wall above the desk was a sheet of paper. One line scrawled in thick black marker. He was never yours. Clara ripped the paper down her hands, shaking. She turned to find Leo standing silently in the doorway. He hadn't barked. He hadn't growled. But his body was tense, his eyes locked onto the broken cabinet. He knew. Clara knelt beside him. We have to go. By the time Sophie arrived after school, Clara had already packed a duffel bag and loaded Leo into the back of her aging Subaru. She stood in the parking lot, waiting, coat buttoned high against the wind hair whipping around her face. Sophie saw the worry etched into Clara's posture before she even said a word. What happened? Sophie asked, backpack still hanging from one shoulder. We've been compromised, Clara replied, forcing calm into her voice. Someone broke in last night. They took the chip. Sophie's eyes went wide. Did they hurt Leo? No, Clara said, looking back at the car where Leo watched from the back seat. But they want him back. Sophie stood quietly for a moment. Then she nodded once. I'm coming with you. Clara hesitated. You need your mother's permission. She's out of town until Saturday. And if they're after Leo, they might come here again. You said he's safer with you. Clara sighed, recognizing the same determined glint in Sophie's eyes she had once seen in her daughter's. She unlocked the passenger door. Get in. They drove south for over an hour, the landscape changing from suburban calm to sprawling forest as they neared the edges of the Blue Ridge foothills. Clara's family had owned a small cabin there for decades, originally her grandparents', then passed down to her mother and eventually entrusted to Clara, though she hadn't used it since Lily died. It had been her daughter's favorite place, a 2-bedroom wood-frame cabin nestled under sugar maples with a stone fireplace and a back porch overlooking a creek. By the time they arrived, the light was already fading. The cabin looked untouched, a little sagging at the porch corners, but still sturdy. Clara unlocked the door and exhaled as the familiar scent of old pine and wood smoke wrapped around her like an old quilt. Leo padded in behind them, sniffing the walls, the floor, the air his tail slowly lifting into a soft sway. Clara lit a fire while Sophie explored, her voice echoing through the rafters with awe. "You stayed here as a kid?" she asked. "I brought Lily here every fall," Clara said, voice soft. She used to name all the chipmunks after book characters. Sophie grinned. "This place feels good." That night Leo curled up near the fire, his head resting on the old braided rug Clara had once hated for its colors, and now found comforting. Sophie lay on the couch, reading aloud while Clara took notes by the fire about the break-in, the missing chip, and the message they'd left. She hadn't called the police. Not yet. She doubted they would believe her. Some things couldn't be reported the normal way. The next morning, Clara woke to the sound of laughter. She stepped onto the porch in her flannel robe to find Sophie in the field out back tossing a faded tennis ball into the air. Leo dashed after it, bounding through the grass with an energy Clara hadn't seen in any of the days since he'd arrived. His stride was still awkward, untrained, but he was running. Not stiffly, not out of command, but out of joy. Sophie clapped as Leo returned, tail wagging, ears perked. She knelt to ruffle his fur, and he leaned into it, licking her cheek with surprising enthusiasm. Clara watched from the porch, tears pricking at the edges of her eyes. He was learning joy again, one toss at a time. That afternoon, Sophie sat with Clara under the porch awning while Leo snoozed beside them, tongue lolling slightly out of his mouth. The wind carried the scent of pine and creek water. "Do you think they'll come here?" Sophie asked. Clara looked out into the forest, eyes scanning the tree line. "If they do, they'll find someone who's not afraid to fight." Sophie nodded, then whispered, "I used to feel like I wasn't really real, like people couldn't see me. But Leo does. It's like I matter to him." Clara looked at her heart, heavy and full at once. "You do matter, Sophie. To him. To me." Sophie leaned against her side. "I want to help protect him, however I can." Clara smiled. "You already are." As the sun dipped behind the ridge, Clara knew they couldn't stay hidden forever. But for now they were safe, and Leo, once a silent, broken creature, was learning to be a dog again. The wind had shifted by the time Clara returned from the post office. Her coat pulled tightly around her shoulders. The sky overhead scattered with streaks of orange and steel gray. Autumn in the Blue Ridge always brought a strange hush, like the mountains were holding their breath waiting. Tonight, Clara felt it in her bones. Not fear, not any more anticipation. The kind that comes before a reckoning. She opened the cabin door, arms full of envelopes, and found Sophie on the couch beside Leo, who was sprawled across the rug like a sleepy lion. The radio played softly from the kitchen NPR, just loud enough to catch bits of news between the cracks in the cabin walls. "Anything yet?" Sophie asked, eyes wide. "Not yet," Clara replied. She pulled out her phone and double-checked the inbox. No messages. Not from Julian Hart, not from any of the 3 editors he'd promised would run with the story. Julian had been cautious at first, skeptical even. A veteran investigative journalist in his 50s with a reputation for chasing whistleblower cases, Julian wore corduroy in summer and had eyes like iron filings. His gruff voice never softened, but his ethics were unshakable. When Clara first reached out with Emmett's data, the chip's photo, the broken cabinet, and her field notes, he had paused only once. "You're telling me this dog survived neural behavioral modification," he said, "and someone broke into your clinic to reclaim what amounts to illegal tech. If even half of what you've written is true, it's all true." He'd leaned forward. "Then we have a story that's going to make a lot of people very uncomfortable. Over the past week, Julian had flown in, interviewed Clara in the back booth of a diner on Route 9, and quietly verified every scrap of evidence. He'd spoken with Emmett, tracked down Sophie's phone photo of the intruder's license plate, and followed the paper trail back to a shuttered defense lab in Northern Virginia, one that hadn't filed a single tax document since 2018. Now the piece was finished, ready to go live on multiple platforms simultaneously. All that remained was a single green light. Sophie sat up straighter as the kitchen radio crackled to life with the evening segment. A breaking investigation by journalist Julian Hart has unveiled evidence of a classified military program involving non-consensual testing on animals. Clara froze. Known as Project Hazel, the program appears to have used canines as test subjects for behavioral modulation through neural implants. Leo lifted his head, slowly, ears twitching. Clara turned the volume up. In the face of this story, Leo, a rescued golden retriever who was found injured and unresponsive in Asheville, North Carolina, is quickly becoming a national symbol of resilience. According to Dr. Clara Monroe, the veterinarian who discovered the implant, Leo's recovery marks not only a medical miracle, but a moral one. Sophie gasped. "You're on the radio." Clara barely nodded her hand, trembling around the mug of tea. The host continued reading excerpts from Julian's article, then snippets of anonymous testimony from former lab staff. No names, no locations. But the picture was clear: the Hazel Project had existed, and now the world knew. By morning, the internet was ablaze. Photos of Leo, calm, golden, his soft amber eyes framed by sunbeams on the cabin porch, were shared thousands of times. Memes called him the dog that fought back. Hashtags trended: Hazel Truth, #Leo Lives, Freedom for the Forgotten. Calls poured into Clara's clinic voicemail reporters, activists, people who had once worked in military research asking to speak off the record. Clara kept her phone on silent, letting Julian handle the chaos. But something shifted in Sophie. Later that day, Clara found her sitting alone outside the cabin, a sketch pad in her lap, her legs crossed in the grass beside Leo, who lay with his nose touching her knee. The girl was no longer withdrawn, no longer whispering into corners or hiding behind her hair. She looked up at Clara, smiling wide. "I told some kids at school about Leo," she said. "About the chip. About what he went through. They didn't laugh. They asked if he could come for show and tell." Clara laughed softly. "What did you say I said? He doesn't talk out loud, but he's great at keeping secrets." That evening they made spaghetti and garlic bread and sat on the floor in front of the fire. Leo rested between them, his head in Clara's lap tail, occasionally thumping the floor. The world outside was storming threats and attention, praise and outrage, but in here there was stillness. There was something that resembled family. Before bed, Clara knelt beside Leo and fastened a new tag to his collar, a simple brass disc etched with just one word: home. She looked at Sophie. "Would you like to help me with something official?" Sophie's eyes sparkled. "What kind of official?" Clara pulled out a set of papers from her bag, formal adoption documents. "I want to make sure Leo stays with us, no matter what." Sophie hugged her so tight it knocked the papers from Clara's hand. Later that night, as the crickets chirped and the fire dimmed into embers, Clara stepped out onto the porch. Leo followed, settling beside her. Then Sophie, in mismatched pajamas and bare feet, curled up on the other side of the dog. They sat like that, three silhouettes under a star-pierced sky. And for the first time since this all began, Clara felt something final loosen inside her chest. Peace. Sometimes the miracles we seek don't come with thunder or lightning. They come on four legs, wearing a collar, carrying scars no one else can see. Leo wasn't just a dog. He was a soul, once silenced, set free not by science, but by love, truth, and a quiet kind of grace. This story reminds us that even when the world tries to control or break us, there is something divine in the act of choosing to live, to trust, to heal. Whether you call it fate, faith, or the gentle hand of God, Leo's journey proves that redemption is always possible, even for the forgotten. So if you're watching this, maybe you're facing your own silence. Maybe you've been running or hiding or hurting. But hear this, you are never too far gone. And no matter how broken the world says you are, God sees you whole. If Leo's story touched your heart, please share it. Let someone else feel the hope. Leave a comment with your thoughts or simply type Amen to stand with Leo and all creatures who long to be free. Subscribe to this channel if you believe animals deserve love, not pain, and may God bless you wherever you are watching from. May He protect the voiceless, strengthen the broken, and guide the kind-hearted who stop to listen. Amen.